Hi guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Reading Bear and I hope you are ready for some more stories. And today, we will take a look at some new revenge content. If you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comment. And now, let's dive right into the stories.
First one is entitled Lady's Porsche Loses Tires. Okay, so this story took place back when I was in Florida in the early 90s. It does involve an act of vandalism that is connected to revenge. Hopefully it won't be removed and hopefully it will count as nuclear revenge. Anyway, South Florida was devastated by Hurricane Andrew. My dad, as part of a local charity, was set up day after day at a local market seeking donations from shoppers to give to food banks. You have to understand this storm left many people homeless and without power, in some cases for 6+ months in Florida heat and humidity. My father was legally disabled from a serious car accident. He was hit by a drunk driver in the early 80s and suffered from relentless hip and back problems. It never killed his heart or kindness to others, hence the charity work. One day he was about to pull into the disabled space at the local market to go buy a few items to donate to the hurricane charity. Right before he is about to pull in, this lady pulls into the space in this shiny red Porsche. My dad parks behind her and says, "Excuse me ma'am, I was about to pull in there," and also points to his disabled placard in the window. She says to him, "PFFT, you don't look disabled," and proceeded to walk into the store. For anyone who has a relative who uses a disabled space, you know the frustration of this situation and the anger one feels. My dad, seemingly unfazed, waits until she goes into the store and then gets out and snips the valve stems on all 4 tires, flattening, but not destroying all of them. He then pulls into another space not far away and just waits. About 15 minutes later, the lady comes out and is shrieking about her car being vandalized. My dad is far enough away so she can't see him, but he can hear everything. She calls the police. Big mistake. She files a report for vandalism, and the police give her a ticket for being parked in the disabled space with no placard. About $250 at the time. The cops leave and she calls a tow truck. As the car is being loaded onto the truck, my dad pulls up and says to her, "You don't look disabled, but your car sure is," and then drives off. My dad could be a nice guy and pure savage when he needed to be. Next one is titled, Escalating Feud Leads to Dad Orchestrating His Brother's Arrest. My uncle has always been a self-righteous, petty slime ball, with a foul temper and grandiose idea of his own importance but little to no brains. My dad always just took it and tried to keep the peace because family is so important to him. This is the story of how my uncle finally pushed my dad too far and ended up getting arrested for his trouble. It is pretty long since it covers several months of a feud between them. As background, my dad and my uncle are neighbors in a rural community of 600-ish people. My dad built the house my uncle lives in and sold it along with a small plot, so my dad's remaining land is about 6 acres and runs along the side and the back of my uncle's smaller property. My uncle is a dealer for HVAC units. My dad is in the HVAC business and would buy some things from his brother, even though his brother's prices were higher and he had a more limited inventory than other dealers, in order to help his brother out. My dad also rented a building his brother owned and used it as his shop, office. He only rented the building and parking lot, but in the field out behind the shop my uncle and my dad both would collect old HVAC units. These things are rusty and all around fugly, but when they didn't have anything else to do they could go get one of these old units to break down for scrap. This story starts when one day my dad went to his brother and said he needed a certain unit, but his brother quoted him a really high price and also couldn't deliver in the time frame my dad needed. So my dad called up another dealer he works with and that guy had a unit on hand to give him for a much lower price. A no-brainer. My uncle found out about this somehow. Dudes in the HVAC business are apparently like gossipy teenage girls, and confronted my dad, basically giving him an ultimatum that if my dad wouldn't commit to buying 100% of his units from my uncle, then my uncle wouldn't sell him anything. I already told you my uncle is an idiot. So my dad didn't say anything to his brother, but he took him at his word and stopped buying anything from him. A month or so later my uncle showed up at my dad's shop and confronted him again, wanting to know why my dad hadn't ordered anything from him that month. When my dad told him why, my uncle exploded. They apparently had a screaming match, and in the end my uncle announced that my dad was no longer his brother, they were no longer doing business together, and my dad was evicted from the shop. I will note that legally my dad was not evicted because evicting him would have required a legal notice, a certain period of time, etc. But my dad was over it, so he said fine and began converting the barn at his house into his new shop. So my uncle, who apparently had thought my dad would not call his bluff, showed back up at the shop a few days later and informed my dad that he also has to move all of the old HVAC units scattered around in the field behind the property or he would sue my dad for the cost of removal. Now, this too probably had no legal power, since my dad's lease was only on the building, not the field, and my uncle contributed to and used the old units as communal property. But when my dad is pissed off, he is really pissed off. So he agreed to move the old units. He took his tractor over and loaded each one onto his flatbed trailer, drove out behind his barn, and painstakingly arranged hundreds of rust bucket fugly old HVAC units an inch or two off the property line at the back of my uncle's house. Note that my dad could not see these things from his house due to the way his property is set up, but my uncle had an HD view of them in his backyard. My uncle started being even more of a creep than usual and was always spying on my dad's house, so my dad decided to build a privacy fence down the side of his property that runs along my uncle's property, but not the back of the property where the HVAC units are. The fence guys arrived and worked for a few hours before my uncle came screeching into his driveway and exploded out of his truck already screaming because these poor fence guys had laid posts or tools or whatever temporarily on his side of the property line as they were building the fence. My uncle called the police, who basically told the fence guys, "Okay dudes, just don't put anything on this crazy man's property," and left. The next day apparently someone left a hammer across the property line, so here comes my uncle screaming at them again. He called the police again, but by the time they got there the guy had already moved his hammer, so the police were just annoyed by this point but could only warn them not to do it again. Later that afternoon, my uncle called the police a third time, I kid you not. This time he wanted to report that my dad had stolen a backhoe from him. Like one that attaches to the back of a tractor. One that, again I kid you not, my uncle had given to my dad 2 whole years prior because my uncle didn't even have a tractor big enough to attach the thing to. The cop was not amused when this story came to light, and since it was the same cop who'd been there earlier that day, she was beyond annoyed at that point. My dad helpfully said, "Come get the backhoe if you want it," knowing full well my uncle had no way to pick the thing up or haul it even the few feet to his own yard. My uncle replied that my dad was just trying to trap him and would say he was trespassing if my uncle came onto his land, even though the cop was standing right there when my dad offered, and, by the way, this conversation was taking place in my dad's driveway. He then said that he wanted to file a complaint with the police that basically amounts to a restraining order against my dad. It isn't a restraining order because it isn't issued by a judge, but the cops treat it that way. It's for habitual trespassers. Annoyed cop helpfully informed my dad that this would mean that even if my uncle texted or emailed him and invited him to come over to his house to discuss things, even if my dad had that written proof he'd been invited, if my uncle called the cops or even took a picture of my dad on his property, he could potentially get arrested for trespassing. My dad said he wanted to file one against his brother too. The pro-revenge part of the story is now upon us. My dad knew full well that his brother had no real clue where the property lines were and was not going to dig up his survey to check. He only knew where the lines were because my dad knows exactly where they are and maintains wooden stobs in the ground periodically along his property lines. So when his brother was away for a few days, my dad moved all of the old HVAC units along the property line over further onto his own property by a few feet and moved the stobs back the same distance. So basically it looked the same as it had before, except it looked like the property line was a few feet further back than it actually is. He then placed some random piece of scrap across the fake property line, still on his own property, but it looked like it was across the property line if all you had to go by were the incorrectly placed stops. Set up a few game cameras aimed at the line, and waited. Sure enough, his dumbass brother came storming out of his house as soon as he noticed this scrap on his side of the property line, crossed the real property line to get a good look at the scrap, and called the police. My dad was waiting for them with his survey showing where the actual property line is, a copy of the report annoyed cop had given him, and game camera footage of his brother clearly trespassing on his land, and it was my uncle who got arrested. The only way his revenge for all the trouble and heartache his brother caused could possibly have been any sweeter would have been if it were an annoyed cop who showed up at the scene and arrested my uncle. But alas, he had to make do with someone he and his brother had both gone to high school with, which worked out since it was especially embarrassing for my uncle to be arrested by someone he knew well. And who could make sure everyone else in town knew? Edited to add. Nothing really came of my uncle's arrest, or at least not that my dad has heard about, and he'd hear about it since this is a town of like 600-ish people. But it was probably enough for my uncle just to have to get put into handcuffs, spend a night in jail, and have people know about it, because my uncle hasn't caused any more trouble for my dad other than generally existing where my dad occasionally has to see his truck drive by. My uncle is also now in a business dispute with his wife's sister and his brother-in-law, so presumably he is trying to take his anger out on another target who hasn't already beaten him, and also who isn't his older and much larger brother who has been perfectly willing to beat his butt all their lives whenever it's devolved into physical disputes. Yes, my family are rednecks. My uncle, aunt, cousin and my cousin's wife all unfriended me on social media, so I only know what's going on with them via small-town gossip nowadays. My sister was driving down the road recently, saw my uncle in his yard, and waved at him. He turned away like he didn't know her. None of us got an announcement when my cousin's wife had her baby recently. So I think the end of the story is just that we are all dead to my uncle and his family, but he is too afraid to do anything besides pretend we all don't exist. Next one is titled, "Well, have fun, replacing me." I was working for a company paid for me to travel to a job in another city. This was done by going into town and getting a coach the company puts on. I would waste 3 to 4 hours a day unpaid to go into town and get home after a 9-hour shift. I asked to be paid to just drive my own car from home and go to work. They said no, and if I didn't like it they would replace me. I called the bluff, but they hung the phone up on me. I started to panic and frantically started looking for another job. I applied for everything I could even remotely be capable of doing but got nowhere. I called back my employer and she laughed at me down the phone. I was gutted, but I just needed to get a night's sleep and come out fighting fresh in the morning. I woke up to a phone call from a new employer eagerly offering me an interview. I said yes without even thinking. As soon as I hung up the call I got another, then another. 5 job offers I got in total. A few days later I had accepted a job working for a delivery company, better pay and benefits. I took a picture of me in my new uniform and sent it to my old employer with the caption, "Thanks for replacing me, I replaced you with a better employer." Last one is titled, "Bad coworker thought she could push the manager around." I have a troublesome coworker that thinks she can push the store around. She constantly tries to change her schedule so she can get hours that she wants even though it makes things hard for the store. Let's just call her Stacy, and she has a history of doing this for over the past year. Well, this year Stacy decided to tell the boss that she couldn't open the store anymore and that she was only available from 8 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. Furthermore, she tries to blame other employees for things that she doesn't get done. Last year she decided to cause an issue with another employee, and that employee turned her in for food stamp fraud. To give you a little background, Stacy lives with her boyfriend and he happens to work for a government contractor making over $20 an hour plus overtime. Her boyfriend went out of the way to buy her a brand new car to go back and forth to work. In this regard, Stacy lied to the social services by not telling them that he lived in that household. After the report was filed, Stacy came into the store to buy groceries. However, she paid in cash, which prompted me to ask her why she didn't use her EBT card. She had told me that somebody turned her in and that her EBT card was shut off. In order to get her benefits back, she moved out and reapplied for food stamps. Once she was approved, and got her benefits back, she broke her lease and moved back in with her boyfriend. Fast forward to this year. Our store was having attendance and cooperation issues. As a result, there was a store meeting where corporate got involved and every store employee had to be present. During the meeting, they stated that all of the applications for the current employees had an availability for any day and any shift. In order to rectify the problems that our store has been having, corporate has decided that all employees will get scheduled for different shifts, including opening and closing. Stacy decided that she didn't like that, and over the weekend decided to send a message over Facebook stating that the schedule had better be changed. Stacy threatened the assistant manager by saying she is not working nights and she would not be coming in those shifts. I received a phone call from the store manager saying that Stacy had called out for her shift today and that I would have to cover it. Keep in mind, I already had plans to go out to dinner for my birthday with my parents. While I don't mind the overtime, I am not happy that I had to cancel my reservations and blow off my family. As a result, I have made a call to the social services building in my county and made a report that Stacy is committing EBT fraud. Moreover, if they check the address they have on file for her, they will find that she is no longer living there, and that the owner of the property will be able to verify that she broke her lease. This will be the second time that they will catch Stacy lying to them about her living situation. Being that this will be more than one instance where she lied, in order to receive benefits, it's very likely that she'll be charged with welfare fraud. So now maybe she'll be looking at more days off and spending that time in a cell waiting to be arraigned. Thanks for listening.